You're standing in the shadow of the Parthenon at dusk, watching a procession wind through the streets below. The marble glows golden in the fading light. Philosophers debate in the agora. And then you see her, a girl no older than 10, barefoot and silent, being led by a chain toward a house where her childhood will end tonight. She doesn't cry. She's already learned that crying changes nothing. Ancient Greece built Western civilization on columns of marble and minds of genius. But beneath every temple, behind every philosophical breakthrough, existed a machinery of human destruction so systematic that it functioned like any other industry. What made it most terrifying wasn't its cruelty. It was its efficiency, its acceptance, its complete integration into daily life, as unremarkable as buying bread or offering wine to the gods. Before we go deeper, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're watching from. It amazes me that stories buried for millennia can connect us across every continent, that we're all drawn to understand the darkest chapters of human history together. The evidence for what you're about to discover doesn't come from rumors or exaggerated tales. It survives in court documents, household accounts, business contracts, and philosophical treatises written by men who saw nothing wrong with documenting exactly how they profited from the systematic destruction of women's lives. These weren't criminals operating in shadows. They were respected citizens conducting legal business, their transactions preserved in archives that scholars still read today, with a mixture of academic detachment and barely concealed horror. The girl in chains, let's call her by a name that appears repeatedly in those records: Neaira. Though she represents thousands, her specific story survived because it became evidence in a legal case. Testimony preserved not to honor her suffering, but to settle a property dispute between wealthy men. The fact that we know her name at all is accidental. A fragment of humanity preserved in documents designed to prove she had none. Neaira's fate was determined before she could form memories of anything else. She was purchased as an infant by a woman named Nicorete, who had developed an expertise that modern language struggles to describe without flinching. Nicorete could look at abandoned baby girls and predict which ones would grow into the kind of beauty that wealthy men would pay fortunes to access. She didn't raise children, she cultivated assets, investing years in a product that would generate returns for decades. The training began immediately, though calling it training sanitizes what actually happened. These girls, Nicorete bought 7 in total, lived in what appeared to outsiders as a normal household. They learned music and dance, poetry and conversation, how to move gracefully and speak charmingly. But every skill had a single purpose. Every lesson led toward the same destination. They were being shaped into perfect instruments of pleasure for men who would purchase their bodies the way other collectors acquired rare sculptures or exotic animals. The psychological architecture of this grooming reveals sophistication that makes modern trafficking operations look crude by comparison. Nicorete called these girls her daughters, created artificial family bonds that would make them dependent on her approval, competitive with each other for her attention. She presented them as freeborn rather than slaves, a calculated deception that allowed her to charge premium prices from clients who believed they were deflowering young women of good family rather than purchased property. When these girls reached puberty, 12, 13, sometimes younger, the final phase of their commodification began. Their virginity became the most valuable transaction of their lives, auctioned to the highest bidders in negotiations that treated the destruction of childhood as entertainment worthy of celebration. The amounts paid for these nights reveal the economic scale. A single transaction could equal what skilled craftsmen earned in a year. The girls themselves saw none of this money. They were the product, not the vendor. What happened after that first sale determined the trajectory of lives that would span decades, but offer no possibility of escape or improvement. Most became pornai, the lowest tier of prostitutes in Greek society's carefully calibrated hierarchy of exploitation. They worked in brothels that operated openly, legal businesses paying taxes to the same city-states that erected statues to gods of justice and wisdom. These establishments functioned with the efficiency of any commercial enterprise: standardized pricing, quality control, customer satisfaction metrics, all applied to human beings reduced to service providers of the most intimate kind. The mathematics of their existence were brutally simple. A pornai might service 20 or 30 clients daily, generating substantial revenue that flowed entirely to her owner. She received minimal food and shelter, just enough to keep her functional as a profit-generating asset. Pregnancy was forbidden because it interfered with availability. The methods used to prevent it involved toxic herbs and crude procedures that often caused permanent damage or death. Many women didn't survive their 20s. Those who did faced aging in a system that valued only youth and beauty, their futures holding nothing but disposal or sale to even worse conditions. But the sexual exploitation, horrific as it was, represented only one dimension of the machine that consumed these women. The legal framework of ancient Greece created something more insidious than simple abuse. It constructed a reality where their suffering wasn't just permissible, but legally protected, philosophically justified, and economically essential to the functioning of civilization itself. Female slaves existed in a state that Greek law defined with chilling precision. They were property, not persons. They could not own anything, enter contracts, or speak in their own defense. The single exception reveals the sadistic logic underlying their legal status. They could testify in court, but only under torture. The Greeks believed slaves would only tell truth when experiencing extreme pain. So, when their testimony was needed, they were stretched on racks and whipped until they spoke or died. Many died. Their bodies were discarded, the information extracted considered more valuable than their lives. The everyday violence extended far beyond legal proceedings into every corner of existence. Masters possessed unlimited authority to beat, brand, and chain their female slaves, with only one restriction: they couldn't kill them outright. Not because of moral concern, but because dead slaves generated no income. This calculation that a woman's life mattered only as long as it produced profit defined every aspect of how society treated her. Branding was routine, used both for identification and punishment. Female slaves were marked with hot iron symbols designating ownership and function, their skin becoming a permanent ledger of their status as property. These brands served a purpose beyond mere identification. They ensured that even if a woman somehow escaped, she could never pass as free. The scars marked her forever, visible evidence of her fundamental otherness in a world that divided humanity into those who owned and those who were owned. The chains varied by function and location. Household slaves might wear lighter restraints that allowed work, but prevented escape iron bands around ankles connected by short chains that limited stride length, creating a distinctive shuffling gait that announced their status before anyone saw their brands. Others were kept in basement cells when not actively serving, brought out only when their labor or bodies were required, then returned to darkness that became their entire world beyond those brief emergences into light. What makes this systematic violence most chilling is how completely it had been normalized. Greek literature casually references beating slaves as routine household management, no different from discussing how to store grain or repair roof tiles. Philosophers wrote extensively about the proper techniques for controlling slave behavior through physical punishment. Aristotle devoted passages to this topic, treating human suffering as a technical problem requiring systematic solutions. He argued that different types of slaves required different approaches to discipline, that the body of a slave was made responsible for all misdeeds because their inferior nature precluded rational persuasion. Demosthenes, whose speeches are still studied as masterpieces of rhetoric, argued in court that physical punishment of slaves wasn't just acceptable, but necessary for maintaining social order. He stated explicitly that corporal punishment should be the last resort for free citizens, but the first response to slave misbehavior. This wasn't controversial rhetoric. Designed to shock, it reflected mainstream legal reasoning, values so widely accepted that defending them required no special eloquence. The scale of this system exceeded anything most modern people can easily imagine. Archaeological evidence suggests slaves comprised between 20 and 30% of the population in major cities like Athens, tens of thousands of human beings living as property, with women and children forming a significant portion of this enslaved workforce. They weren't primarily prisoners of war or criminals serving sentences. They were people bought and sold in markets that operated as openly and legally as any other commercial exchange. The slave markets themselves functioned with the efficiency of modern commodity trading floors. Women were categorized by age, appearance, skills, and sexual experience, their prices fluctuating based on supply and demand, calculated with the same attention merchants applied to grain or olive oil. Dealers specialized in different types of slaves. Some focused exclusively on young women destined for sexual exploitation, maintaining inventories of human beings, cultivating relationships with suppliers throughout the Mediterranean world. The business was so profitable that wealthy Greeks invested in slave trading ventures the way modern financiers buy stocks, diversifying portfolios that might include shipping, agriculture, and human trafficking as equally legitimate enterprises. The purchasing process reveals the calculated dehumanization at the system's heart. Potential buyers examined female slaves like livestock at auction, checking teeth for health, inspecting bodies for scars or deformities, testing responsiveness to commands. Women were forced to display themselves for crowds of men who discussed their physical attributes as openly as they might evaluate horses or oxen, comparing breast size and hip width the way farmers assessed breeding stock. The most valuable slaves were those who could serve multiple functions. A woman who could cook, clean, weave, and satisfy her master sexually commanded prices far higher than one with limited capabilities. This economic logic created a nightmare of versatility, where women had to master domestic arts alongside sexual techniques, knowing that inadequacy in any area might result in sale to worse conditions or owners who viewed them as disposable. Some wealthy Greeks operated what can only be described as human breeding programs, selecting female slaves with desirable traits and forcing them to reproduce with male slaves chosen for complementary characteristics. The children born from these unions belonged entirely to the owner, who could sell them, kill them, or raise them for specific purposes within the household. The practice was openly discussed in literature on household management, treated as sound economic strategy rather than the biological horror it represented. Female slaves who became pregnant faced impossible choices they weren't allowed to make. Masters typically forced abortions using methods both primitive and dangerous: toxic herbs, physical trauma, crude instruments inserted into bodies with no concern for permanent damage or death. The procedures were performed by other slaves or by the owners themselves, often in conditions that guaranteed infection. Many women didn't survive. Those who did often suffered injuries that left them unable to bear children, even if they somehow gained freedom and the opportunity to choose motherhood. When children were allowed to be born, usually because the master saw potential profit in raising a slave child rather than purchasing one, they faced immediate separation from their mothers. Slave women were forbidden from forming emotional bonds with their offspring, who were considered household property rather than their children. Mothers who showed excessive attachment faced brutal punishment designed to sever these natural bonds, teaching them through pain that their maternal instincts were as irrelevant as any other personal desire. The systematic disposal of unwanted slave children reveals the complete moral bankruptcy of this system. Infants were regularly killed through exposure, abandonment, or outright murder when owners deemed them economically unviable. Female children were particularly vulnerable, considered less valuable than males for most forms of labor. The practice was so common that it appears in household accounts as a routine expense category, the cost of disposing of unwanted births. Greek society had constructed elaborate justifications that allowed citizens to participate in these atrocities without questioning their moral character. Aristotle's argument that some people were naturally born to be slaves, that their inferior nature made bondage beneficial for both slave and master, provided intellectual framework that transformed systematic cruelty into philosophical necessity. This wasn't fringe thinking, it was mainstream ideology taught in the same schools that produced the mathematical and scientific breakthroughs we still celebrate today. The religious dimension added spiritual torture to physical and psychological abuse. Female slaves were forced to participate in household ceremonies that celebrated the very system enslaving them. They poured wine for libations, honoring gods who allegedly sanctioned their bondage, served at feasts celebrating their master's prosperity built on their suffering, maintained shrines dedicated to deities who offered them no protection or hope. This spiritual isolation compounded their physical captivity, severing them from any source of divine justice or afterlife redemption. The economic network supporting female slavery extended throughout the Mediterranean, creating international trade in human misery that dwarfed most legitimate commerce. Ships regularly transported cargoes of enslaved women between Greek cities, specialized dealers maintaining inventories and supply chains with the sophistication of modern logistics operations. The profits funded many cultural achievements we associate with Greek civilization: the Parthenon, the philosophical schools, the theatrical productions that defined classical culture were all built with wealth extracted from enslaved labor, including the sexual exploitation of countless women whose names history never recorded. The Greeks, renowned for their meticulous record-keeping, left behind chillingly detailed evidence of their normalized cruelty. Legal contracts for buying sex slaves, household ledgers recording the upkeep of enslaved women, and court cases over ownership disputes all survive proof of a vast system of exploitation that endured for centuries. Most haunting is how completely this order corroded moral conscience. Freed women found their suffering dismissed as inevitable, while even free Greek women, constrained by their own limits, upheld the very hierarchy that brutalized others. Sexual violence was so normalized that rape was treated as a property offense, not a human crime. Masters faced no punishment. Consent held no meaning. Enslaved women couldn't name themselves, choose clothing, eat, rest, or govern their bodies. Every breath of their existence was controlled living instruments stripped of autonomy, regarded as flesh-bound tools rather than souls. The psychological techniques used to break spirits were as sophisticated as modern brainwashing programs. New slaves underwent systematic processes designed to destroy individual identity and replace it with complete submission. They were given new names, forbidden to speak native languages, punished for any behavior suggesting independent thought or emotion. The goal was total erasure of self, transformation of a person into a function. The methods used to maintain psychological control reveal calculated cruelty. Female slaves who showed resistance faced punishments designed not just to inflict pain, but to serve as warnings. Public beatings were common, with slaves forced to witness torture of their companions as reminders of their own vulnerability. The isolation techniques were particularly devastating rebellious slaves separated from others, kept in solitary confinement for weeks or months, deprived of human contact except when being used for labor or sexual service. This social deprivation broke many women more effectively than physical violence. Masters employed sophisticated systems of rewards and punishments, creating artificial hierarchies among enslaved women. Those who demonstrated complete submission received slightly better treatment, creating incentives for slaves to police each other's behavior and report defiance. This turned victims against each other, preventing formation of bonds that might lead to collective resistance. The system was designed to make solidarity impossible, to ensure that even in their suffering, these women remained isolated from each other. Through the chains, brands, and forced violations amid rape, abortions, and erasure, something endured that Greece could never kill. It flickers in court records of defiance, in women like Neaira, who somehow survived, in whispers of secret sisterhoods born under oppression. These women were never passive, they resisted, though history tried to silence them. Their story reveals a darker truth. The temples, philosophies, and democracy we revere were built on suffering by men preaching virtue while enslaving and exploiting the very women they dehumanized. Understanding this history isn't about condemning modern Greece or dismissing ancient achievements. It's about recognizing how easily entire populations become complicit in systematic dehumanization when it serves economic and social interests. How intellectual sophistication and cultural brilliance can coexist with moral bankruptcy, so complete that people document atrocities without recognizing them as such. The voices of these enslaved women have been largely silenced, their names forgotten, their suffering reduced to footnotes in histories focused on the men who enslaved them, but the archives remain. The contracts and court cases, the household accounts, and philosophical treatises, they sit in libraries across Greece and beyond. Testimony to crimes that a civilization committed not in darkness, but in broad daylight. Not despite its values, but because of them. Every student who reads Aristotle's defense of natural slavery, every tourist who photographs the Parthenon, every philosopher who builds on Greek foundations encounters this history whether they acknowledge it or not. The girl in chains walking through Athens at dusk disappeared into a house where her screams echoed for years before silence finally claimed her. She had a name once, before it was taken and replaced with one chosen by her owner. She had dreams once, before she learned that dreaming changed nothing. She was human once, before a civilization built on marble and genius decided she was property instead. The columns still stand, the texts still teach, and somewhere in an archive, a document records her sale price, preserved for millennia while her humanity was buried in unmarked graves that archaeology will never excavate.